Hey guys, I got smoke in the bow. Smoke in the bow. Whoa. Whoa, holy. I need to know who is on deck. Where's Tyler?
Flames exploded out of the Wizard's engine room, catching the crew completely off guard. The crew scrambled, their faces covered in sweat and fear as the heat became unbearable and the fire refused to stop. Tyler's cries echoed from below deck, trapped as the fire spread faster than anyone could react. How did a routine day at sea turn into a fight for survival in seconds? Let us uncover how this unstoppable fire pushed the crew to their breaking point and whether they all made it out alive. The fire that almost took them all. You could almost feel the hesitation in the air. It was a lose-lose situation. Wait and risk more damage, or push forward, risking everything for Tyler. But there wasn't time to ponder. The leader's decision was clear. They had to move. With safety gear hastily secured, they opened the hatch, praying they'd find Tyler in time. But the smoke wasn't waiting. It swarmed them immediately, thick, black, and suffocating. Each breath felt like swallowing ash, yet they had no choice but to keep pushing. This wasn't just a bad day at sea, this was a full-on fight for survival. How many more of them would be caught in this unrelenting blaze? Before we delve into this, it's clear that the events aboard the Wizard were far more dangerous than they first seemed, and the real cause will leave you speechless. Somehow, they managed to get Tyler. There he was, barely conscious, needing every bit of their strength to pull him out. The cheers were quiet, more like sighs of relief. One person saved, but the fight was far from over. The fire roared on, the alarms echoing the urgency, and smoke kept sneaking into more compartments. Every crew member knew their part, but the fear was etched on their faces. How much longer could they hold on? Would they be able to get the fire under control before it claimed more than just a piece of the ship? With Tyler safe, they slammed the hatch shut, hoping it would keep the fire in check. For a moment, silence hung thick. It was that fragile kind of calm, the eye of the storm. Someone called in through the radio, a voice ringing clear amid the chaos, letting everyone know that, for now, they were okay. But they all knew the truth. The Wizard was still on fire, and no one knew what might happen next. The relief they felt was fleeting, overshadowed by the damage still being done below deck. It was a temporary victory in an ongoing battle. The alarms had blared almost immediately when the blaze broke out, and the CO2 system did its thing, flooding the area with suppression gas. It was supposed to buy them time, but time was not on their side. The fear in their eyes wasn't just for themselves, but for a young boy caught near the flames. Someone's son, a kid with a whole life ahead of him. The worry was like a thick fog that wouldn't lift, even as they got word that the fire seemed to be subsiding. The emotional weight of it all lingered heavily, every moment a reminder of just how easily they could lose someone. Nothing was certain until they heard, "Everyone's safe." Even then, they didn't breathe easy. How much had the fire already taken from them? Just as things began to look a little less grim, the lights flickered, then died altogether. Panic surged through the crew, who were now plunged into darkness. Flashlights were hurriedly passed around, but there was a sense that something more was brewing. Smoke curled up from the lower decks, finding its way into every crevice and filling the boat with the acrid smell of burning metal. It wasn't just a fire now, it was an all-out catastrophe. The crew's worst fears were coming true as they discovered the damage to the engine room, the core of their vessel, now blackened, smoking, and utterly silent. There was no time to dwell. They had to move quickly, every second critical. Communicating with the outside world became a frantic goal, their voices echoing through the radio waves, desperately trying to reach someone who could help. Smoke in the engine room became a chilling refrain over the comms. But the silence that greeted them was worse than the fire. The realization hit. They were alone in this. The Wizard's crew, isolated out in the vastness of the ocean, had to fight their way back without any backup. Back in the engine room, things were getting out of hand. The team scrambled to find out the extent of the damage, each face marked by exhaustion. They were trying to stay ahead of a problem that was changing faster than they could keep up. There were burnt wires, destroyed machinery, and worst of all, they might need to shut down the engine entirely. With every failed attempt to fix things, the crew realized just how dire their situation was becoming. The thought of losing power completely was almost too much to bear. They needed to act fast, but no one knew if it would be enough. The fire was out, but it left behind damage that pushed them to their limits. The damage left behind. The fire was under control, but the aftermath was no less chaotic. CO2 had saved them from the flames, but it hadn't saved the ship from the damage. The reality of what lay ahead was sinking in. This was no simple fire that they could just put out and move on from. The ship was scarred, the systems failing, and their survival now rested on how well they could improvise. The engine, the electrics, the structure itself, it was all hanging by a thread. Every mistake could mean disaster, and the pressure on each crew member was immense. Hours bled into each other as they fought to stabilize the ship. In the middle of this chaos, another problem emerged: a melted containment unit, a puddle of molten parts that used to be vital machinery. The fire was no longer raging, but the damage it had caused spread like a disease. One crew member called for fresh air, another went for tools, and they all moved with a determined urgency, knowing that they were running out of time. There was no room for errors now, they were already on the brink. Miles from the nearest shore, a whole 170 miles to be exact, their chances were looking slim. The focus now was on clearing debris, trying to reroute power. They needed the engines back on, the crab pumps running, anything to keep them afloat. Edgar worked tirelessly on fixing electrical connections, each twist of a wire met with gritted teeth and a prayer. The fire had knocked them down, but they weren't out yet. Every action was deliberate, a careful balance of hope and survival. They couldn't afford to slip up, not now. Edgar was at the center of it all, the man who, despite the chaos, kept pushing forward. His hands were steady, his focus unwavering, even as the wreckage seemed to grow around him. There was something almost hopeful in the way he talked to the machines, coaxing life back into the dying ship. And finally, there it was. A flicker, a light. It wasn't much, but it was something. The crew's cheers were more exhausted than joyful, but they knew what it meant: hope. They weren't beaten yet. The pumps sputtered back to life, and it felt like maybe, just maybe, they'd make it out of this nightmare. But before they could catch their breath, a voice cut through the static. "Set up GPS for autopilot." Another sharp command, a new task, and suddenly they were thrust back into the fight. In the dim glow of emergency lights, the crew worked in sync, setting the course, trying to steady the Wizard in the rolling waves. Then, out of nowhere, a bright flash lit up the dark waters. It was there and gone in an instant, but it left everyone stunned. What was it? A flare? Lightning? No one knew, and the uncertainty gnawed at them. This was no ordinary night at sea, and the strange lights only made their fears worse. The electrical chaos wasn't over. A mistake somewhere along the way had triggered a malfunction. Wires crossed, breakers blown, and suddenly there was more to deal with. As if the fire and smoke weren't enough, a small blaze flared up again. Fire extinguishers were grabbed, frantic hands moving to put out the new threat. It was a constant balancing act. One crisis handled, another cropping up. The crew leader's voice remained calm even as he gave orders, shifting people around, directing efforts with an authority that kept panic at bay. It was the only thing holding the chaos together. The crew worked tirelessly, their movements automatic, instinctual. Years of training and experience showing in how they navigated each setback. Communication was everything, each member in constant contact, knowing that even a second's delay could spell disaster. Slowly, painstakingly, they began to regain control. Small victories, a compartment sealed, a wire repaired, the smell of smoke finally starting to fade. But none of them let their guard down. They knew better. Out here, anything could happen. They all knew they weren't out of the woods yet. The fire may have been under control, but the damage was done. The Wizard was a bruised and battered ship, its systems barely functioning, and the storm on the horizon promised nothing good. They had stabilized things for now, but no one knew what challenges still lay ahead. Each moment brought new threats, and they had to be ready for anything. Their survival was still very much in question, and every crew member knew it. The lessons learned that night wouldn't be forgotten. They'd fought through fire, darkness, mechanical failure, and more, relying on each other and their training to make it through. It was a stark reminder of just how unforgiving the sea could be.
That's where those crabs should be.
It's certainly looking that way.
Every day at sea brought new challenges, but this one had been something else entirely, a battle for survival that none of them would forget anytime soon. They had faced the worst, and though they weren't out of danger yet, they had made it through the night. Just when things seemed calmer, the sea showed them how hard staying alive could be. A glimmer of hope in the dark. But the night wasn't done testing them. The hours dragged on, and though they had made some progress, they were far from being out of the crisis. The relentless waves pounded against the hull, each one a reminder of how precarious their situation was. The Wizard wasn't just a boat anymore, it was a battle zone, and every inch of it seemed ready to betray them. It wasn't enough to have survived the fire, they had to ensure that every part of the ship could make it through the night. As the hours ticked by, Edgar kept working with a determination that went beyond sheer survival. He moved from one part of the engine room to another, each step calculated, each movement a test of his endurance. The heat was almost unbearable, the sweat dripping down his face as he rerouted wires and checked each connection. The machinery groaned under the strain, and Edgar could feel the pressure of the entire crew's hopes resting on his shoulders. There wasn't a single person aboard who wasn't counting on him to pull off a miracle. Above deck, the rest of the crew was in constant motion. They cleared debris, checked the seals on every compartment, and kept a wary eye on the horizon. The storm they had feared was still gathering, dark clouds rolling in from the distance, promising nothing but trouble. The wind was picking up, and the Wizard's damaged systems weren't equipped to handle the rough seas. It was all they could do to keep things steady, to keep moving forward inch by inch, trying to find a way out of the chaos. The strange flash of light from earlier still haunted them. No one could explain it, and the uncertainty of what it meant only added to their anxiety. There were whispers among the crew. Some thought it might have been a signal, others feared it was something far worse. The unknown was often more terrifying than the dangers they could see. And in the midst of all this, the radio remained silent. No one was out there. No one to hear their calls, no one to offer a hand. They were on their own, and that realization was a heavy burden to bear. The fire had left its mark not just on the ship, but on the crew as well. Faces were drawn, eyes wide with exhaustion and fear, but no one gave up. They couldn't afford to. Every minute that passed without a new crisis was a victory, no matter how small. They took turns resting, though rest was little more than closing their eyes and hoping for a brief moment of peace. The tension never left, and even in those brief moments of respite, there was always the knowledge that something could go wrong at any second. And then it did. A sudden jolt ran through the ship, a shudder that brought everyone to their feet. The engine, which had been struggling along, suddenly gave a final groan and went silent. The hum of the machinery that had been their lifeline cut off abruptly, leaving only the sound of the waves and the creaking of the ship. Panic set in immediately. The engine was their only chance to get out of this, and now it was gone. Edgar's face was a mask of disbelief, the exhaustion catching up to him as he realized just how much worse things had gotten. The crew scrambled, their training kicking in despite the fear that gripped them. They had to find a way to get the engine back, to get power restored, or they were finished. Edgar wasn't ready to give up. He dove back into the machinery, his hands moving with a precision that spoke of years of experience. He could feel the eyes of the crew on him, the weight of their hope and fear. There wasn't time for mistakes. Each wire, each bolt had to be checked, every possible solution explored. Above deck, the storm had arrived. The waves grew larger, crashing against the sides of the Wizard, each one threatening to capsize the already weakened vessel. The wind howled, tearing at anything not bolted down, and the crew fought to keep their footing. Water sprayed across the deck, cold and stinging, mixing with the sweat and grime that covered their faces. It was a battle on all fronts: the storm, the engine, the uncertainty of what might come next. Hours turned into a blur, each one more grueling than the last. Edgar worked tirelessly, his hands raw and aching, his eyes stinging from the smoke that still lingered in the air. He knew he was running out of time, the storm wasn't going to let up, and without power, they had no way to navigate, no way to keep the Wizard from being tossed around like a toy. But he wasn't ready to give in. There had to be a way, something he hadn't tried yet, something that would bring the engine back to life. They had made it through the fire, but the storm ahead was ready to push them even further. Surviving the worst night at sea. And then, finally, there was a spark. It was small, barely noticeable, but it was there. Edgar's heart raced as he worked, coaxing the engine back, his hands moving faster now, fueled by the hope that maybe, just maybe, they could get through this. The crew watched, holding their breath as the engine coughed, sputtered, and then, with a shudder, roared back to life. The cheers that went up were raw, filled with a mixture of relief and disbelief. They had done it. Against all odds, they had brought the Wizard back from the brink. But they weren't safe yet. The storm was still raging and the Wizard was far from fully operational. The engine was running, but the damage was extensive and they were still a long way from shore. The crew worked together, each person taking on whatever task was needed, no matter how small. They patched holes, secured loose equipment, and kept an eye on the horizon, hoping that the storm would pass and give them a chance to catch their breath. The night seemed endless, the darkness pressing in on them, the waves relentless. But there was a determination among the crew that hadn't been there before. They had faced the worst and come through it, and now, even with the odds still stacked against them, they knew they could make it. The Wizard was battered, but it wasn't broken, and neither were they. They moved forward inch by inch, the engine struggling but holding, the crew exhausted but resolute. The first light of dawn was barely aglow on the horizon when the storm finally began to ease. The waves grew smaller, the wind less fierce, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, there was a sense that they might actually make it. The Wizard, scarred and weary, cut through the water, its crew working tirelessly to keep it steady. The radio, still silent, was a reminder of just how alone they were, but it didn't matter. They had each other, and that was enough. As the sun rose, casting its light over the endless expanse of ocean, the crew took a moment to breathe. They were alive. The Wizard was still afloat, and they were heading towards home. There was still a long way to go, still repairs to be made, still the unknowns of what lay ahead. But they had faced the fire, the darkness, the storm, and they had come through it. And as they looked out at the horizon, they knew that whatever came next, they would be ready. They had no choice but to be. The sea was unforgiving, and every day brought new challenges. But the Wizard's crew had proven that they could face them, no matter how impossible they seemed. The fire had tested them, the storm had pushed them to their limits, but they had survived. And now, as they sailed towards the distant shore, there was a sense of pride among them. They had fought for their lives, for each other, and they had won. The path wasn't over, and they all knew it. The Wizard was still far from being in the clear, and the damage would take weeks, maybe months, to fully repair. But they had made it through the worst of it, and that was enough for now. As the sun climbed higher, warming the deck and drying the salt water that coated everything, the crew allowed themselves a moment of rest. They had earned it. And yet there was always that lingering question, the one that none of them could shake. What else might the sea have in store for them? The fire, the storm, the strange light, these were just the beginning. The ocean was vast, unpredictable, and there was no telling what lay ahead. But as the Wizard sailed on, its crew battered but unbeaten, they knew one thing for certain. Whatever came next, they would face it together. They had to. Because out here, in the middle of the endless sea, there was no other option. It was fight or perish, and the crew of the Wizard had proven that they were fighters. And as they moved forward, each wave carrying them closer to safety, they held on to that determination. The sea could throw whatever it wanted at them, and they would face it head-on. Together. What else could possibly go wrong out here? The question lingered, a reminder of the uncertainty of the ocean. But as the crew looked ahead, the horizon stretched out endlessly before them, and they knew that whatever came, they would be ready. They had no other choice. Was the fire on the Wizard an unavoidable accident, or could it have been caused by something or someone on board? Share your thoughts and don't forget to like and subscribe for more.